see. Okay. Okay. And then you just hold on tight.
we're just sitting at the table.
You could come up to the podium. Would that be easier for you? Because you want to look
The
at.
problem is, yeah, I use my PowerPoint as my notes. I mean, I can go get my laptop from my car. Oh, you're gonna start? Okay, no, okay.
Well, you're not up for a while. Well, yeah. So you can.
Oh, I can go get my laptop at the break. Isn't there a break between us?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that then.
You're not.
Oh, okay. No, it's not, but my first one right here. Right here.
Okay, great. I will stand here, stand by.
Yeah, so it's my intros are really short. I mean, it's like Lindsay, it's just Lindsay, you know.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started, so settle in, and thank you for being here. And we're going to start with Barbara Meltzer, Chair of the Human Services
Okay.
Commission.
Actually, that was my script, Corey, but that's okay. That's fine. Good morning. Welcome. We're so happy that you're here, and we are so pleased to be able to present this event. My name is Barbara Meltzer. I chair the West Hollywood Human Services Commission, and I have the pleasure this morning of introducing two fabulous women, one of whom was so instrumental in helping to make this happen. So please welcome West Hollywood City Council member Lindsay Horvath.
Good morning, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning, and I'm so glad that you made time in your schedule to be here and be part of this conversation, which is so critical, not only here in West Hollywood, although you'll hear about why it's so important here in West Hollywood, but regionally and throughout the country. We know that this is a growing issue, and which means that there's growing need. And so that's something we really need to be checked into as local leaders and be supportive of the organizations who I know are present here in the work that you do to help support our community. So for everyone who does provide that work, I just want to say a special thank you, because without you, we couldn't be the kind of community that we are. It's my pleasure, as I said, to welcome you to West Hollywood. Today's community forum will provide an overview on Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, including perspectives from healthcare and social service professionals. And we know that there are over 5 million Americans living with Alzheimer's, and as many as 16 million will have the disease by 2050. Those are pretty astounding numbers, and we hear numbers like that, but it's really hard to take in the magnitude of the impact that we'll be experiencing as a result of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. We also know that we need to do more to understand Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia in order to address the increasing prevalence of these diseases, the emotional, financial, and physical toll on caregivers, and the costs of healthcare and long-term care for individuals. And we know we're continuing to have that conversation about the cost of healthcare over and over, and it feels like it's never ending. You would think that by now, with all of the stories that we've heard and all of the stories that have been told, that we would be able to say that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and but we will continue that fight as long as we need to make sure that everybody understands that, especially some folks in the White House. Conversations like today's community forum allow us to focus on efforts on what we need to do going forward to address these issues compassionately and effectively. And I'd like to thank the committee members who helped to put this forum together. From the City of West Hollywood, David Juni, who's our social services manager, Corey Roskin, who is our social services specialist, Leslie Eisenberg, our social services administrator, and of course, the one and only Barbara Meltzer, who chairs our Human Services Commission, but also serves on the LA County Commission for Older Adults. She's been working with the city and county of Los Angeles and their efforts on aging. She serves on the board for AARP in California. I don't think there's an organization that focuses on aging and how to support our aging population that Barbara isn't a part of, and her expertise is absolutely invaluable to our community, and we're very, very grateful that she continues to serve as much as she does. She's one of those people that I don't think there's one part of her body that isn't willing to be of service, and so for that I am especially grateful. And of course, many of you know also Elizabeth Savage, who is retiring from our city, but we know that she has left an indelible mark on our community, and we thank her for her leadership and how she shepherds along our social services, recreation, housing, and everything that she's done for so many years. I'd also like to thank Jewish Family Services of Los Angeles, Mandy Carpenter, the manager of Arts, Wellness, and Engagement Program, Sheila Moore, Senior Director of Comprehensive Senior Services, obviously Supervisor Sheila Kuehl's office, and I know that she has representatives here today, but this we certainly appreciate her partnership in this effort. And Stephanie Cohen, the LA West and Metro District Director from Supervisor Kuehl's office. And finally, the Alzheimer's Association of Greater Los Angeles, Susan Howland, the Director of Caregiver and Community Education, and truly everyone who's been part of this conversation. As many of you know, aging in place, aging in community has become a mantra here in West Hollywood, and this conversation is one important component of that, but so many of you have been critical in advancing that conversation, and I thank you for the work that you do. So thank you again for attending, and I look forward to our continued dialogue. If there's ever anything that I or my colleagues can do to work with you on these issues, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are glad to be of service, and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you. The second terrific woman I'm introducing is our moderator, Val Zavala, who is anchor, reporter, and producer for KCET's weekly award-winning news magazine, SoCal Connected. She has won, among other awards, 19 LA area Emmys. Val also serves on the board of Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles. Please welcome Val Zavala.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for battling the traffic. That's half the challenge in Los Angeles. I'm very, very happy to be here. Personally, I think all of us have stories that have motivated us to be sitting here right now. My father had Alzheimer's and made, unfortunately, life very difficult for my mother in her last years. My mother survived my father by 7 years. She had dementia, but it wasn't Alzheimer's, it was vascular dementia. So I've seen them both. They're both really, really sad, heartbreaking. We all know what it's like to lose a person before they're really gone. It's like dying before you die. So we are very motivated not only to help the families here, but to educate ourselves and eventually find a cure. I'm also really happy to be on the board of Alzheimer's Greater LA, which used to be, I'm going to go ahead and say, it used to be Alzheimer's Association, but then things changed. So now it's Alzheimer's Greater LA, and all the donations, all the resources go and stay within Los Angeles Greater LA area. We help families, give tremendous support, and we also contribute part to research here in Los Angeles. So it's a totally localized focus now, which is really, really terrific. You'll hear a little bit more about that. It's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker. She is an amazing expert on dementia and Alzheimer's. Her name is Linda Ercole. She is clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. And I almost forgot to mention, there are cards in the back. I hope you pick them up. So while you're listening to the speakers and you have questions, please write them down on the cards, and we will definitely get them to you, get to them before the end of the talk. And of course, you can read the full biographies of all the people in the handout that you got. All right, so Linda Ercole is, as I said, clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry. She has also done amazing research in the neuroimaging and neuropsychology of aging of Alzheimer's, caregiver stress, as well as looking at how effective the educational programs for memory enhancement are. You know all those promises that you do this test or take that course and it'll affect your memory. She probably looks at it much more critically and finds out whether they're really worth it or not. Anyway, she's got a lot to say, and she'll elaborate on how to define and diagnose Alzheimer's. Please join me in welcoming Linda Ercole.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out today. It's my pleasure to be here in the city of West Hollywood and to share the day with my colleagues at Jewish Family Services, Lisa's Place, Alzheimer's Greater LA. We all rendezvous, and of course with ARP. So thank you for coming. Now the riveting title of my talk, it's very cut and dry, but it's about dementia and how we actually diagnose it and work it up. Now, the reason this is important is because part of what I do for a living is help with the diagnosis of people with dementia. And one thing that really gets me is I see people sometimes late in the game, and they've gone a long time without being diagnosed. And there are things that we can do for people. There's no cure for many of the dementias, Alzheimer's being the main. But there are things that we can do to slow down the disease, to help family members cope, which we're going to have some information on caregiver stress, which is so important, and to help get people situated, planned for the future. We've got it all covered today with the panel. But I'm going to talk about the first steps in how you can begin to maybe recognize it and what you can do if you suspect that somebody may be going down that road, or maybe that you are. I don't want to scare people. This is not about that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's normal and what's not normal in aging, and then go more into the various types of dementia, mainly focusing on Alzheimer's disease. So let me just see if I can advance this. Okay, so I'm already technically challenged. Sorry about that. Vertically and technically challenged. All right. I might wish one. Oh, is that it? Thanks. Okay, great. So what is the word dementia, right? Well, dementia is kind of a blanket term, an umbrella term. But right now, we call it, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, it's been changed to major neurocognitive disorder. I think the word dementia has such negative connotations, it scares so many people. I remember even in the movie The Addams Family, I think one of the cousins, her name was Dementia. So, I mean, you know, this is true. And so we're thinking about it more, get rid of that label. Even though I'll use it interchangeably today, I'm in the process of giving it up. But a lot of people still use that term. But essentially, it involves a number of major factors. The first is you have to have cognitive impairment. And that cognitive impairment can be pretty much any kind, but most of the time it's memory, plus other things like higher level cognitive functions that we use to reason and plan and problem solve. Some people lose their language ability. But we have severe cognitive problems, and this is the key, that get in the way, that interfere with daily life. So most of us, I mean, how many people have complaints about their memory and their cognition? Do we all have major neurocognitive disorder? No. So it's about interfering with your daily life, number one. Number two, dementia or major neurocognitive disorder, depending on the type, involves all sorts of other things, right? So we're talking about personality changes. Some people become aggressive. Some people become really irritable. Other people become apathetic. It's like they don't want to do anything. We see mood changes, severe depression, anxiety, and even delusions and psychosis. So it's a package deal, dementia. I know that when we talk about it, when we hear about it, people always focus on the cognitive, but all the behavioral disturbances that go with it, that's the part that really brings down the caregivers. So I want to emphasize that that's all part of major neurocognitive disorder. Right, the other key is it's acquired, meaning this comes on later in life. All right, and people aren't born with it. And this is a key factor because there are lots of reasons why it comes on, and this has to do with ways that we could possibly prevent or reduce our chances of getting it, or whether it's genetic. So there are lots of reasons why it develops later in life. And typically, it connotates that there's an underlying brain disorder, and it can be anything, and I'm going to talk about that. So major neurocognitive disorder is an umbrella term, and you can see all the different types of dementia that are included under that umbrella, and that's not the whole list. And we're learning more and more about these types of dementia every day. I mean, they get reclassified and redescribed, and we have to keep up with the literature on this. But notice, too, that there are some reversible types of dementia. Dementia that can come on because of problems with vitamin deficiencies or thyroid problems. That's why it's so important to get a workup, because sometimes people are experiencing changes that can be treated. So they all have the commonalities of the behavioral changes, the cognitive changes, but there are differences in what causes them, when they come on in life, like do you get them before you're 65 or after, or when is the most likely time, how they come on, usually gradually, and what types of impairments people have cognitively, and they differ in terms of how they're treated. Okay, so let me give you a schematic of what happens. So first of all, people start developing cognitive changes. And depending on the type of dementia, these can actually start years in advance. And you might be someone might be experiencing them and not actually have dementia yet, but they're in the early stages and it could take years to come on. But typically, as the cognitive changes get worse, people's ability to function in daily life worsens too, right? So we can all get by with a little bit of forgetfulness. Where did I put my glasses? That's why they're on my head. Where did I put my keys? But when this gets to the point that you can't work, that you can't keep up with your medications, right? That you're dangerous when you're driving a car, these types of problems don't happen in the earlier stages or with mild forms of cognitive impairment. So as the functional abilities go down, as the cognition gets worse, that's when the behavior problems typically get worse too. Now, this isn't true for certain types of dementia like frontotemporal dementia, which I don't know if anyone's ever heard of frontotemporal dementia, but it attacks the frontal lobes of the brain, and sometimes the earliest symptoms can be behavior change and personality changes, even before the cognitive changes. But let's just talk generically, especially with Alzheimer's disease, this is what This is more of the trajectory. Oops, let me go back there. And then, of course, the more impaired someone gets, the more behavioral problems, the more time that caregivers have to put in, and by the way, the more stress they are under. But first, to understand dementia, we really need to know, so what's normal with aging, right? Because we could all think that we're going to get dementia, and nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know. But let's talk about what some of the differences are. So number one, when somebody begins to age, and this we're talking about 40s actually, their speed of thinking slows down. So if you think about computer processors, and when you get that brand new computer, it's fast as can be, right? It lightning bolt onto the internet. But as that computer ages, it slows down, and that's essentially what happens to our brains. We're really at our peak when we're like in our 20s, 18, 19, 25, but actually our brain processor starts to slow down when we're in our late 20s, early 30s. We don't notice it, but we start to notice it as we get older. I certainly noticed it when I drive. I just used to be able to, be kind of a speed demon and make quick decisions, and now I notice that I'm more careful because I can tell that I don't have that speed, that agility in being able to, see that light and cut out and cut somebody off. I can't do that anymore. Good thing. But seriously, I feel the difference when I drive. And so this definitely, it's taken a while for me to notice that my processor has slowed down, but it's been a good 10 years now for me. So learning and retrieving slow down. So when we're younger, we can learn something maybe when we see it the first time, all right? As we get older, we need to maybe see it 2 times. When I work with people who are in their 80s, they may need to see it 3 times. But a lot of that is normal. What's important is that you're able to learn it. And the amount that we learn lessens with age, but in normal aging, people don't forget what they learn. It might take them a little longer to learn it. It might take them a little longer to bring up a name of someone or a word, right? But typically, people don't have what we call an amnestic syndrome. They don't forget rapidly. Once you learn it, even if you're 75 years old, you remember it. This is not the case in dementia. People with dementia forget that first of all, they have a hard time learning it, and they forget it very quickly. That is why people will ask you the same question over and over again in 10 minutes. Has anyone ever experienced that? Yeah, okay, that's because the very fact that they were told we're going to the Hollywood Bowl tonight, right? They forget it. It's gone. So they'll ask. They know that you told them something, but they can't remember the specifics anymore, and so you'll get that question again in 10 minutes, 5 minutes. That's because the memory trace just completely dissolved very rapidly. So that's what you're seeing when someone asks you the same question repeatedly. And then word finding difficulties when it's on the tip of the tongue. This is the most common complaint associated with aging. I typically don't worry about it unless it's beginning to interfere with people's flow of speech so that they have a lot of pauses in their speech. When people come to see me for a cognitive evaluation, this, I guarantee you, 90% of the people will have that complaint. And I'm sitting there going, you're not alone. You're not alone. But if it is actually causing like stilted speech, and you notice it, and it's interfering in your flow, then that's something that you have to go, maybe this isn't so normal. And then higher level cognitive functions. So when you think about multitasking, this is something that's really sensitive to normal aging. Maybe when you were younger, you could put makeup on and drive the car and switch the radio station. I know we see people doing it now, but those kinds of abilities tend to be more sensitive, very sensitive to aging. And you put the speed, the slowing down of your processor on top of that, and that's what makes it so difficult. But people who are aging should be able to reason. They should be able to problem solve, right? But again, just managing large amounts of information at once and multitasking becomes more difficult. It's more of an efficiency issue than anything. It's really not that there's a problem, but it's just our efficiency, our ability to juggle. Instead of juggling 5 things, now we're juggling 3. So these are the kinds of things that when we say higher level cognitive functions, we're talking about switching your attention, we're talking about monitoring for errors. So those little errors that we make, or leaving something out in a recipe, that's part of that aging process. Now, if you're monitoring your errors, forgetting to pay bills every month is not an error monitoring issue. So there's a big difference. Even if it's in self-defense, it's not an error monitoring issue. So this is a trajectory that we have of cognition and normal aging. So you could see at the top of the graph, that's normal functioning. So on the left, the vertical axis is cognitive functioning. High is good, low is bad. And on the horizontal is time. So when you look at thinking over time, it naturally does decline. But there is this transitional stage that we call mild cognitive impairment. That's a gray area. And this is often an area where a number of those people that have mild cognitive changes are going to develop dementia. And it's at the rate of 12 to 15% of those people a year. But who are they? And it's a gray area, because we don't know necessarily who's going to develop what, but we have much, much better ways of predicting it. And so this is the point where if people are having concerns, serious concerns, that's when people can start to get evaluations, and there can be cognitive testing, there can be certain workups done that essentially will indicate to some degree if those cognitive changes that you're experiencing, if they're normal for your age, or if they're more severe than what would be expected for your age. And this is where you're going to want to get a workup to look at what's your body chemistry, right? What's your blood work? So they're going to look at, your doctor's going to look at different things to help determine if there's anything that could be causing it. If this is something normal, don't worry about it. If something that we just say, well, so far everything looks good, come back in a year and we'll check you then. So this is the gray area, but this is the area where people can actually do something and start to do something about their memory changes. And then you can see dementia is diagnosed way down there at the end. And the goal of medicine now, besides curing various dementias, is to detect it early so that we can at least employ the treatments that we have now to slow down the progression of disease. So that's another reason why it's so important to get checked out if you have a loved one that you think something's changed, something's different, is don't put your head in the sand, right? Because your loved one can go downhill before your eyes. There are things that we can do to help. So what is this mild cognitive impairment? That's a very busy slide, but I'm gonna bullet point it down to this. People have changes with their cognition. They're not changes consistent with normal aging. They're worse, but they're not so impaired that it meets criteria to have a major neurocognitive disorder. They're somewhere in between. They have complaints. Most people are noticing that they have impairment. Often their family members might say, yeah, I think that, his or her memory isn't so efficient anymore. I think he's beginning to forget appointments and things that he never used to do. But they're still able to function. They're still able to work. You're still able to do all your household life tasks, but there has been a change. So this is the part where we know, though, now that there can be an underlying disorder. And so when somebody gets a workup for this, that's what they're trying to find out. Now, Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, okay, or major neurocognitive disorder. Of course, it was brought into the limelight by famous people that have been in the news, that have come before us. But we know that it's at an explosive rate in our society, with about 5.5 million people right now with Alzheimer's disease or some other kind of dementia in the United States alone. Now, what is it? Well, it was actually discovered, if you can call that a discovery. I mean, people have been having it, but there was actually somebody who in 1906 came to a doctor, Dr. Alzheimer's, that had severe memory problems. Notice, though, she was only 51 years old. So this was actually an early onset Alzheimer's disease. So although we're familiar with it happening over the age of 65, there's a smaller percentage of people that get it before 65, in their 50s and 60s, and even younger sometimes. So this was the first case. We never hear about that, but it's early onset Alzheimer's disease. And when he did an autopsy of the person's brain, he saw the plaques and the tangles, which are the neuropathological hallmarks of the disease. And that's what they look like under high-powered microscopy. The plaques are protein deposits that occur in the brain, and the tangles are also proteins. They're part of the scaffolding of our cells that break down and deteriorate and affect the communication along the neuron. And there's a whole process that goes on that leads to this, and that process more than likely starts very early in the game, way before anybody has symptoms. And so, as you'll probably hear from the Alzheimer's Association, or you can go to their wonderful website and look up what people are doing now to try to actually treat people or discover these early stages of the disease and how to maybe stop it at that point. So our research is focusing on every stage of this disease, including people who are asymptomatic. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. It's neurodegenerative, meaning that the brain continues to deteriorate. But you can see that there are plenty of other kinds of dementia you saw on the umbrella slide, but also you can look more closely. We have Lewy body dementia, which is the second most common form of disease. Oh, sorry, wrong slide. Okay. This shows the age ranges, so let me back up. Age ranges. Alzheimer's disease is an age-related disease. It's most common the older you get. And that's what this slide shows. In fact, you can see that about 40% of the people in their 80s can likely have Alzheimer's disease. So when you think about how many people have Alzheimer's disease, think about how many people are in the precursor stages of Alzheimer's disease. Triple that number. That's why we are so focused on treatment, because this is an epidemic. And as America grows older and as the world grows older, we're going to see more of this. So the onset is gradual. Early onset is before the age of 65. Late onset is after the age of 65. And it's generally a slow progression, average 8 to 10 years, but I've known caregivers who've been taking care of their loved one for 20 years. And I've seen people go down in 4 years. But the average is 8 to 10 years. There are some genetic risks for Alzheimer's disease, but let me reassure you, the majority of cases of Alzheimer's disease right now are not related to a dominant form of the disease. Dominant meaning that if one of your relatives has it, you have a 50% chance of getting it. In fact, that accounts for about 3% of Alzheimer's disease. These are rare forms on genes presenilin genes on chromosomes 14 and 1, and notice on chromosome 21, which is a Down syndrome gene. And people with Down syndrome have 3 copies. And they get Alzheimer's disease, many of them, most of them, in their 40s and 50s. So a lot of people are studying Alzheimer's by actually helping and working with people with Down syndrome. There's another genetic risk that we call ApoE4, and this is what we call a susceptibility gene, meaning that if you have it, your risk for Alzheimer's disease, especially the later onset form, is higher. But does it mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease? No. So there are certain forms of this gene. There's a form what we call 4. So there's a 2, a 3, and a 4. And it's rare to have 2 copies of that gene, the 4-4. Only a couple of, what did I say, 20%? 20% have 1 copy, and even fewer have 2 copies. But this can increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease, especially between the ages of like 55 and 75. So you can get tested for this. I really don't recommend it because I know that a lot of these take a cheek swab and find out your nationality also includes some of this. And I think on a personal note, I think it scares the heck out of people. You can get testing, but I would recommend that if you do, you would want to really do it if there's a good reason, like you have a high loading of it in your family and you go see a genetic counselor. I wouldn't recommend that you just go willy-nilly. Frankly, I work in the business and I don't want to know. So there are other genes that we don't have time to get into. There's a constant search for genes that might be related to Alzheimer's disease. But right now, those that are up there are the major genetic risk factors. So I just wanted to show you this schematic of early and late onset. I don't know if anyone has ever known anyone with early onset Alzheimer's disease. It's always a devastating illness, no matter when you get it. But when you get it when you're younger, many of these people have children. They're still working, and it just plucks them right out of the prime of their life. And it's a bit different. They face some different challenges, the caregivers and the family, because of the early age of onset. It's much more rare, as you can see. It's only about 13% of Alzheimer's disease, and there's about twice the autosomal or dominant forms of inheritance involved in the early onset as opposed to the late onset. Let's talk a little bit about some other risk factors. So gender, women seem to have a more highly prevalent Alzheimer's disease. We're not sure why, if it has to do with the fact that women tend to live longer, and so the longer you live, your risk goes up, or if it has more to do with the ApoE4 gene and it may have a different influence in women than in men. We don't know. Also, we know that there are some differences according to ethnicity, mostly higher in African Americans and Hispanics compared to Caucasians, and the very lowest in Asians. And again, we don't know why, but one of the considerations is that there are disparities to healthcare, and there are differences in lifestyle that may be related to the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Also, you see, higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease in Latinos and in African Americans, and we now know that having cardiovascular disease like heart problems, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, these are all risk factors for developing dementia. So it could be just by virtue of that as well. There are other risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia that have nothing to do with genetics. So besides age, we have head injury. And we know from some of our studies of NFL players, et cetera, that they have increased risk for developing dementia. Now, it may not be just Alzheimer's. They develop, they have a lot of the tangles in their brain, not so much the amyloid in comparison. But we know that head injury increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease. And the more you have, the greater the risk. So we also have things like early nutrition in life. So if you come from a childhood where you didn't have good nutrition, this could also increase one's risk for Alzheimer's disease later. And then low education. And we don't know, again, if it's that people that don't achieve higher education just don't have a brain reserve, but I don't particularly buy that, because there are many, many reasons why people don't obtain higher education. And it could be, though, I think what more of the thinking is focusing on is that education is protective. So the more you stimulate your brain, the more you grow neurons, really, and from education, from learning, the better protected one is. So the good news is that a lot of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease are modifiable. We could do something about it, and there was this great study by Christine Yaffe up in University of California, San Francisco, that identified the big 7. And of some of those big 7 risk factors you can do something about, and some of them you can't, like age, we can't do anything about. Male gender, genetically speaking, we can't do anything about. But there are things that we can change. So things like hypertension, right? Diabetes, smoking, don't smoke. These are things that that we can control and change to reduce our risks. And the statistical analysis that they did is that you could actually reduce Alzheimer's disease by 10 to 25% if you would take charge of controlling those risk factors, getting exercise, right? Don't be a couch potato. Lifelong learning. All these things can actually reduce your risk. So let's talk a little bit about the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. What is it? How do you diagnose it? How do you know somebody has Alzheimer's disease? Well, very importantly, you have to have plaques and tangles in the brain, and these are seen on autopsy. And we have now imaging tools, so where you can image the brain of a live person and actually be able to detect these structures in the brain. You also have chemical changes in the brain. You lose synapses, brain cells die. And we have neurotransmitter deficiencies, and these are neurotransmitters like acetylcholine that are involved in memory formation. There are lots of stages, or 7 stages of Alzheimer's disease, and I think the major point here is that think of it in 3 ways. Number 1, you don't have it. Number 2, it's very, very mild and ranges from being asymptomatic to seeing mild changes, which may not be detectable right away. But as it progresses into more late mild to moderate stages, now it becomes noticeable. The doctor can see it, you see it. Actually, in the late mild stage, you're going to notice it, and it starts to affect people's lives. As it gets into more severe stages, just the very basic things people can't do anymore, right? They can't feed themselves, they can't dress themselves, and people usually end up bedridden, and they can't swallow. It becomes absolutely debilitating. People say you don't really die from Alzheimer's disease. Yes, you do. You do die from Alzheimer's disease. There may be an opportunistic pneumonia that gets you, but why did you get it? Because you have Alzheimer's disease. I think of it as a terminal illness. That helps me work with my patients, because that helps me take people seriously, right? People don't always take their loved ones seriously when they start to complain. I take it seriously, and it's like, I want to help you pretty much prepare for this as much as you can, and really have a good quality of life for as long as possible. So the warning signs that we've been talking about it all along, but you can generally see the memory is the first to deteriorate, but then other things like problem solving and reasoning start to deteriorate as well. So some of the common things that people forget is they really can't track their medications anymore. You might see extra pills in the medication box. People forget things that surprise you, right? Surprise you, like, you've never forgotten that before, you know. What do you mean your electricity's been turned off? Things like that. So everybody forgets something once in a while, but this is regular and consistent. Then as the disease progresses, these aren't even warning signs anymore. People just can't function at work. They have poor judgment. They have difficulties handling emergencies. It's just their usual self is slowly slipping away. And definitely you might see changes in mood and personality. So what do you do? What do you do if you suspect this? The first thing is talk to your doctor. Do you have a primary care that you like, that you trust, that will listen to you? And that person, if they have good training, maybe they'll do some in-office mental status testing to see if you're having any problems, or they'll refer you to a neurologist. So neurologists typically are those who diagnose Alzheimer's disease. You can also see a geriatric psychiatrist. They're a subspecialty, but this is what they do. They treat dementia and they treat mood disorders in older adults. We have a lot of them in Los Angeles. So you can actually go to a geriatric psychiatrist as well. But definitely get an evaluation. What happens in the workup? I have to tell you, I'm going to be going with my friend tomorrow to UCLA to get a workup. And I am really glad that I'm able to do this for her. I'm going to go to see a neurologist with her. I'm worried about her having not an Alzheimer's process, but another type of process going on. And it's funny because she said to me, "You're the only one I can talk to about this." And that made me sad, right? Because we should all be able to reach out to somebody and not struggle by ourselves with this. So she's going to be going through a lot of this workup tomorrow. And so this is what it is. And I do part of that workup with neurocognitive testing, but when you go to the neurologist or your doctor, these are the things that they should be doing. These are parts of a standard workup for dementia. First is take a really good history of when the problem started. What did you first notice? It's really good to have a loved one there when that interview happens. Because if somebody is really developing an Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body disease or another kind of dementia, they may not have very good awareness of their problems. This is actually quite common. So it's always good to have what we call a collateral, a friend or a relative there. And so besides that kind of information and what you're doing, what you're not doing, they're going to get a really good physical on you and run some blood tests to try to rule out any reversible causes of cognitive impairment. So things like thyroid, vitamin deficiencies, things like that. They're going to ask about how much alcohol you drink and and if you're taking drugs, because these can impair your cognition. And certain heavy alcohol use can result in a type of dementia. So they're gonna look for all sorts of things to either rule in or rule out what could be going on. Also, most people will get at some point an MRI scan of the brain, and I have some pictures of that coming up. And this is a scan that looks at the actual brain as if you are doing a dissection of a real brain. And you can see things like tumors. You can see strokes, because these are things that need to be ruled out too if you're trying to diagnose something like Alzheimer's disease. And then you can get neuropsychological testing, which is what I do and what our team does at UCLA, and it's also at Cedars and USC, is that you get a battery of cognitive tests, and we compare how you do on those tests to people that are of your same age and education level. So we get an idea, are you functioning where you would be expected to function on these tests? So the mental status exam is where in the doctor's office they ask you some very basic questions like what's the day, what's the date. They might ask you to remember a few simple things, ask you to copy something. And depending on how one does on that mental status testing, they may get referred for more tests. They're also going to ask about your mood. Is there depression, anxiety? Are people having hallucinations? Why? Because sometimes, whether somebody has hallucinations, whether they have sleep problems, will help determine maybe they have Lewy body dementia, because you see a lot of sleep problems in Lewy body dementia. You see people acting out their dreams. So all these things are super important to the differential diagnosis. And you might be asked to fill out a lot of questionnaires about that, and it's kind of a hassle, but don't worry about that. Answer those questions because they're vital to the evaluation. So we already talked about neuropsychological testing, but basically if you see a neuropsychologist, we're going to give you a very detailed brain checkup. That's it. We're going to look at your attention, your memory, your reasoning, your judgment, and so it's a real behavioral evidence of memory problems. It's objective data, meaning we're going to do some number crunching and see if you are performing below where we would expect you to be. And then these are some of the blood tests, and essentially they're going to look for whether you're anemic, whether you have a urinary tract infection. This is part, I left a couple out, but generally these are some of the standard blood tests that they will give. And if they're looking for other things, you might get more. This is sort of the standard bottom line. So this is why you want a brain scan. Okay, this is a brain scan where you slice somebody's brain with the computer, that is, like this, and then you're looking down. So what you see here is on the left is a patient who has a normal brain scan. Okay. The person in the middle has Alzheimer's disease, and those big, that bright colored X in the middle is a ventricle of the brain that's filled with fluid. And you can look at the normal person, you see nice and small and tight, right? But then when you look at the middle person's brain, look at that X. It's big and kind of gaping. And that means that there's been atrophy in that brain. The brain has shrunk. And because when the brain shrinks, there's not much pressing on those ventricles to be nice and tight. So you see that type of a pattern. And then, here's the scary part. Some people with early Alzheimer's disease have a normal MRI scan. And there are other scans that we give now to really have more to look. That's why we have scans that look at plaques and tangles and the metabolism of the brain, because they actually have a tell. They're more telling. But you want to get an MRI to make sure that you haven't had a stroke or a brain tumor, and you want to look to see if there's atrophy. And that atrophy typically follows a pattern in Alzheimer's disease and in other dementias, and that pattern will be revealing in some cases for a diagnostic impression. Now, other tests that you may or may not need is a PET scan, and there are different kinds. And these are, PET stands for positron emission tomography. You have to have an injection of a radioactive substance that I call it like a LoJack for the brain. It has an affinity towards certain types of abnormalities, and if it lights up in your brain, then you're gonna see more of those, means that there's more of those abnormalities. And then there's just another type of scan that looks at the glucose metabolism of your brain, which is a very standard scan that's important in differential diagnosis of different kinds of dementias. That is more common. So here's a PET scan. This looks at the glucose metabolism of the brain, and those red and yellow areas, that's good stuff. That means that your neurons are utilizing glucose. And glucose is the main fuel of the body and of neurons. So you want to see it means that those neurons are healthy. They're there and they're healthy. Look at the person in the middle. Now that's the same person that had that normal MRI of the brain, which you see on the right. So where those arrows are pointing, that's an area of low glucose metabolism. In other words, the cells there are not really utilizing glucose. And that's a very classic pattern of that part of the brain, which is back here in the parietal lobes, that you see in Alzheimer's disease. So when somebody has a scan like this, then they start thinking that this could be Alzheimer's. And Medicare doesn't pay for these unless there's a real compelling reason, which has to be for differential diagnosis. You can't just walk in and get one and Medicare will pay for it. No, it has to be ordered by the physician to make a clinical decision and a judgment. But anyway, this is one of the more sensitive tools that we have right now. Now, the other is amyloid scans. So there are different kinds out there, but the one that's FDA approved is called Amivid. And essentially, this detects amyloid in the brain. And you can see here, yellow in this scan is not good. It means that you're lighting up for amyloid. So you're injected with an isotope or a radioactive chemical, by the way, that you get rid of. It doesn't stay in there in your body very long. And it has an affinity for these structures, and it attaches to them, and it starts to give off radioactive information. And lo and behold, the computer will say, there it is, and they'll reconstruct these images. So this is another possible scam. Again, they are not done just willy-nilly. They're very expensive, but many of the research that we have going on through the various studies across the country use this scan. And we're trying to detect Alzheimer's earlier. And also, these types of scans are terrific for judging treatment, because we can see if treatments make that light up reduced, right? So are our treatments effectively attacking the amyloid? So again, these are very good, not just for diagnosis, but for tracking treatment response in clinical trials. So early detection is very important. It's important because the sooner you are able to identify a problem, the sooner you can implement the appropriate treatment. For most neurodegenerative, or for all neurodegenerative dementias, there's no cure. But we can slow disease process down, especially in Alzheimer's disease. There's something you can do. The other important reason is you have to plan. So one of the things that I encounter a lot in my job is people that are not prepared. They have no power of attorney. They get sick and nobody is there to help them with decision making, and then they get in a jam because they may be living alone, they may become disabled, they lose their judgment, and they deteriorate, yet nobody can step in because they don't have anyone who can make health decisions for them. That's why it's so important to make these arrangements. Well, we're supposed to all be making them, because anything can happen to anyone that renders us unable to make a decision. But this is so important in Alzheimer's disease. Who do you want to help make decisions for you if you can't make them anymore about getting you medicine and where you live and things like that? So let's talk about early treatment. So here is our famous curve again, or maybe not. There it is. No treatment, you go downhill. That's that. Early treatment, you can at least extend your quality of life and your functioning longer, okay? But see, without early treatment, pretty much, look where you get that third yellow arrow comes too little, too late. That's why early detection is so important. These are the names of the medications right now that are FDA approved. None of them are cures, but you may have heard of some of these. Donepezil, Razodine, Exelon, or rivastigmine. They have generic, and they have, the more formal names, memantine. So memantine is approved for early and moderate stages, and then your donepezil, galantamine, et cetera, seems to be more mild and mild to moderate. They don't work for everyone, but the idea is that they seem to slow down the progression of disease, but they are not cures. Some other considerations, again, that we've talked about already is what else is going on with your loved one. It's not just cognitive. They may need to get some mood treatment for depression or psychosis or anxiety. And there are major decisions to be made as the disease progresses. Can this person live alone? These are tough places to be with your loved one. That's why it's so important to have family and to have plans in place. We can't predict where it's going to go, but we want to try to be as prepared as possible if somebody's been diagnosed with this. So these are the considerations that we were talking about, legal considerations. Safety, unfortunately, has to do with driving, and should people be using a stove, things like that. Right, and socially, it's very important to keep people active socially, get into activities. Now, what's going to happen is they can't do their usual activities, but we have many other options for people who can go to adult day treatment services and get activities that are more appropriate for their level of functioning. And I think you're probably going to hear some of that from our panel later. I'm gonna end with some other forms of dementia that are more common. Somebody talked about vascular dementia. Who was that? And so this is a dementia that comes from having either a major stroke, which, believe it or not, is not that common, or having multiple little strokes that accumulate and cause cognitive impairment, which you call ischemia, and I see that most often in my job. So these are usually linked, in some cases, to genetics, but usually it's linked to lifestyle, heart trouble, arrhythmias, hypertension, high cholesterol, things that clog up these little arteries and block blood flow. And it accumulates over time and is quiet. Can be silent for a long time, but if you have enough critical mass, you will start to have cognitive impairment. Now, we see a lot of this also comorbid, meaning at the same time as Alzheimer's disease, and when you do an autopsy on somebody's brain who had Alzheimer's, you're going to see quite a bit of vascular dementia in many cases as well. So I don't necessarily see pure cases of vascular dementia once in a while, but I see a lot of what we call a mixed dementia, which is both vascular and Alzheimer's disease. And let me show you what it looks like on a brain scan. So here is our MRI again, and on the left you have vascular changes, and on the right you have a normal brain. And essentially you see all that white capping, they call it capping, around those ventricles. All that white accumulation is what is causing the, I would say, miscommunication and discommunication in the brain. And it actually can cut off communication or, really reduce it between deep parts of the brain, which you're looking at here, and the cortical parts of the brain, which is our higher centers of functioning. So these are the types of accumulations that are seen in people with vascular dementia, and some of it can be quite as extensive and just all over the brain. So Lewy body dementia is the second most common type of dementia, and it really appears quite different than Alzheimer's disease. What you see here is a lot of motor problems. You don't see many motor problems in people with Alzheimer's disease. They appear relatively healthy on the outside for a long time until the disease progresses. With Lewy body disease and other forms of dementias that have to do, like with Parkinson's, they look like people starting to get symptoms of Parkinson's disease. They slow down, they get stiff, they shuffle their feet. They may have a tremor, they may not, and they might fall, have balance problems. Their facial expression, they call it a masked face. They just lose expression. And many of these individuals, some of the earliest symptoms are where they act out their dreams. And this means like people can be violent in their sleep. They can get up and do things in their sleep. They have no awareness that they're doing it, but their loved one can be black and blue from getting a punch. Or they may fall out of bed. And so these kinds of things are tells. It doesn't mean that everybody with that problem, it's called a REM sleep disturbance, is going to have that, but essentially it means that your risk is higher. So what's happening in those people is when we dream, which is in REM sleep, we're paralyzed. And so we don't act out our dream. But when people with a REM sleep disturbance dream, the paralysis is not really there, or it's not there enough, and so they can break through that and act out their dreams and have absolutely no awareness. So if you ask somebody, do you act out your dreams, they'll be like, no. Ask their partner, or ask if they ever end up on the floor or something like that. Also, you might see more prominent visual hallucinations, seeing small animals, seeing small people. And you really have to ask people those questions. I remember a long time ago, I was talking to this man, and I said, do you by chance, see things like little people or animals? And he said to me, you don't know how glad I am that you asked me that question. And he had been experiencing it. He didn't tell anybody. And we were able to get him to a neurologist right away and have him worked up. I believe he had Lewy body dementia. Right, and then they definitely have cognitive problems with attention, visual spatial problems, and they have some memory problems, but it's typically in the beginning not as prominent as in someone with Alzheimer's disease. Now, a scan for someone with Lewy body dementia, if you look on a PET scan, and here's that positron emission tomography scan, you'll see that in the person with Alzheimer's disease, you'll see the red in the back of the brain, and that's the visual area. That's the primary visual area where we get information sent to from our retinas. And in Lewy body disease, that area shows very low metabolism. So that's a tell on a brain scan to tell the difference between Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body. But also remember, you're going to see a lot more motor symptoms in Lewy body disease. I wanted to talk briefly about HIV, cognitive impairment. So HIV is from the virus. The cognitive problems are from the virus affecting the brain. This is a cognitive problem that has a lot more motor and muscular problems, and definitely the risk or the symptoms get more impaired depending on how immunocompromised a person is. So you can see there's stages too. There's a pre-dementia stage, but then there's actually an AIDS dementia-related complex. You can stage it, but essentially, like any staging, it goes from having very mild to non-detectable to mild problems where people can still work, all the way up to being unable to work. And with HIV, you're seeing a lot of motor problems and even paralysis at the end. You can see also that it ends in the vegetative state. I meant to add where people can be mute. So again, from very mild to almost non-detectable all the way to severe motor problems and cognitive problems. And this is another chart that you can look at where we're really contrasting the very early stages to the late stages. And again, you're looking at slow motor movements, you're seeing apathy, which is lack of motivation, and at the end, it ends up with paralysis and mutism. So where are we going, right? Well, we're going towards early detection, treatment, and cures. That's where we're going. We don't know exactly how to get there yet, but we're getting closer. But it of course depends on the kind of dementia that one has. What we're looking for here for Alzheimer's disease is treatments that actually modify, that change the course of the disease. So right now we have symptomatic treatments. They don't reverse the course of disease. They don't stop it. They don't arrest it. They just lessen the symptoms. We are looking for actual treatments that can change the course, arrest the disease. So that's what happens when you don't get anything, right? Placebo, you just go downhill. Symptomatic treatment, you just change that angle of the line. You eventually go downhill, but it's slower. So, and that's what happens when you give somebody Aricept, for example, okay. But what the object here is to actually stop the disease. So you want to modify the disease. So, of course, you can't necessarily reverse, right? It's like a tire. Once you take off tread, you can't put the tread back on, but you can stop the tire from wearing out, and this is what we're thinking about with these disease-modifying treatments. And we're going from everything from medications to nasal sprays because of the link to diabetes, to antibody treatments. We're treating inflammation, and if you look on the Alzheimer's Association website, you're going to see all the latest treatments. You can get involved in a clinical trial and be caught up very quickly on the latest. We're also looking at vaccines. Right now, there are vaccines that we're targeting tau, for example. And again, nasal sprays, pills, everything. There are things that you can do too, right? You're trying to prevent. Now, we can't prevent as in it's not going to ever happen. But what we mean by prevention is to stave it off as long as possible. And there are many things that you can do in your life to help reduce that risk. And one is to change your lifestyle, to live healthy diet, exercise, etc. So this relates to the big 7. So again, what we feel that we can do is at least extend out the age at which one can get Alzheimer's disease by living a healthier lifestyle. And this is the part that makes me feel really excited, because this is, every one of us can do this now. And guess what? It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost anything. You start to walk 20 minutes a day, have a diet that is low in fats, get rid of the processed food. I know it might be hard for some of you. Mediterranean diet is considered a healthy diet, but the idea is to reduce the red meats and the fats, right? And keep stimulated and keep socially active. And this will go a long way towards reducing those risks that we talked about in the big 7. So I think we've gone through this a lot, but essentially, if you think about how we can do this, so if you're looking at somebody who maybe has some developmental problems, or maybe they just didn't get a lot of education, so it's not too late. Get cognitive stimulation, join book clubs, come to talks like this, go listen to music, have conversations with your friends. It's easy, it doesn't cost anything. Again, cardiovascular risk factors, it's diet and exercise, that's it. So depression is another risk factor. You can treat depression. If you've been depressed, go see a counselor. You can go to a psychiatrist. If you don't like meds, there are things that you can do, but treat it. Don't let it go on and ignore it. Don't put up with it. And finally, again, couch potato, get off the couch. Or if you're depressed, get on the couch. And stop smoking. Stop smoking. I saw somebody today in a Prius with a cigarette. I'm like, oh my God, really? Anyway, do yourself a favor, stop smoking. All right, so thank you very much. And if I know we're over time, so.
Just a few questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
So here's one question. Is living alone something that adds to early cognitive disorder? That all depends on who you're living with. If you're living alone and you're not stimulated, I don't think that's good. If you're being isolative, that's not good. But if you enjoy living alone and you're happy, but you have friends and social contacts, that's fine. But I don't think it's the living alone. Ask your divorced friends how they feel about that. But no, I don't think in and of itself it is, but social isolation is a problem. Is that, do the medications really work, or do they prolong the same condition? That's a really good question. They work for some people, not for others. What I have heard anecdotally from when I'm involved in caregiver support groups and people use them is they say it depends what stage your loved one is in. So it could be helpful, but for some people it could prolong if they're in a difficult stage as they're passing through a disease, it actually, I heard this anecdotally, it can prolong that. I think one way to look at medications is to try them. You don't have to commit to them. You can stop them if you don't like what they're doing or if you don't think they're doing anything. But it's often worth a try. There are contraindications for it, so you'll have to talk to your doctor about that. Can I please define treatment again? Yeah. So right now, if we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, the treatments that we have are these medications that enhance neurotransmitter function. So the donepezils, the rivastigmines, Exelon, I always get their names mixed up, galantamine, etc. Those are symptomatic treatments, so they don't change the course of the disease, but what I understand from people who've talked to me about them is they just make them feel sharper. And sometimes it makes their loved one happier. So those are the treatments that are out there right now, and memantine as well. The other treatments can be for other associated symptoms like depression, behavior problems, things like that. So sometimes people end up on psychiatric medications to help with those. Once in a while, there will be people who will go on antipsychotic treatments for behavior problems. This can be pretty controversial. I won't say anything more except that there is a time and a place for them, but you have to talk about the risks with your doctor about that. And can I see a future where we start getting our first cognitive assessments, perhaps with imaging at age 60, a la colonoscopy at 50. I think this is a smart idea. So do I, but it's I don't think anybody's going to pay for it. We don't necessarily need to do cognitive testing on people that don't have complaints. But I think there will be a time, depending on where we are in our research, that we can actually look for some of those really early changes in the brain and maybe treat that. I think that's what we hope, that's where people are going. Right now, I would say, don't come unless you feel like you have a reason, right? If you feel like there's changes and you're worried, then you can talk to your doctor. But I don't think right now, there's nothing that's gonna show the very early silent changes as of yet. So there's really no reason to do that now. But that was a great question. I hope we get close to that. And one more. People with might have early dementia can get an appointment at UCLA. Are they in an HMO? It depends on your HMO. So you have to call up your managed care. If you have managed care, call them up and find out who's included on their roster of providers. Usually UCLA accepts, if you're an older adult, they accept Medicare and many supplements. But if your care is managed, then you're going to have to talk to your provider and find out if they're covered at UCLA. If not, sometimes you can get an outside referral to go. It takes a lot to do that, but you can do that. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Dr. Urkele.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry I went over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Urkele. We're going to take a 15-minute break, so we're a little bit behind, but that's okay. There's some food still out there. There's information tables to check out. If you didn't get your parking validated, there's a machine back there, and I can show you how to do it. And there are some evaluations. If you would grab one off the little table with the parking validation and fill it out at the end, that'll be great. Thank you. Oh, yeah, and come back at 10:40. Thank you.
right, we're going to regather ourselves here a little bit, so if people can gradually get seated, we'll go on with our program. We're going to wait for some folks in the lobby to come in. All right, how are we doing? How many people out there in the lobby? Do we want to give them just another 30 seconds, a minute to come on in? Great. Okay. It is now my pleasure to introduce somebody who has a very different perspective on dementia. She has lived through it through her husband. She is incredibly courageous, her stamina is amazing, and her story is so personal that I think you'll find it very, very moving. Her name is Lisa Bricker. Her husband, Gary, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. He was only 63. It took a long time before he was actually officially diagnosed. It took 7 years. He lost 2 jobs. He was an attorney, a very accomplished professional, and they had to move 3 times. It was quite a journey that she's gone through, and I think her experience will be extremely enlightening. Her husband was not the only one she had to care for. Her father was diagnosed with terminal lymphoma. Her mother was also showing signs of early dementia. So she became very immersed in patients' needs, and she is here now to tell her story. And then she will also be available on the panel for the question and answer period. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Bricker.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor. My journey started, I would say, a long, long time ago, and you never know where your life's purpose is going to show up. My grandfather on my mother's side had a massive stroke about the same time I was born, and he was 59 years old, and he lived for 30 years. And I watched my grandmother during that time growing up. That was my whole experience of my grandparents. And he had vascular dementia. And there were no resources back then. And her life was very, very difficult. Both of their lives were. And at that time, there was only family available to pitch in. So 12 years ago, my father was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma, and I happened to be the family member that stepped up to the plate. And I had no idea whatsoever what I was getting myself into. It became like an Indiana Jones adventure, and we were always waiting for the other shoe to drop. He passed away less than a year later. My mother was showing signs of early dementia. She also had vascular dementia. And it starts a spin cycle with a caregiver. And I'm curious to know how many people here are dealing with family members, know someone, you know, how many people, by a show of hands, are dealing with this disease in their families or friends? Yeah. So we are not alone, and that's my message more than anything else. My husband started showing signs in his late 50s, and at that point he was still employed. We had made a big move out of town after my parents, my mother had moved into assisted living. My father had passed, and so he made a change in jobs. And I think that that's kind of what started the wheels to come off in our lives, because it was not a good fit. And something wasn't right, but we just couldn't put our finger on it. So dementia, Alzheimer's, is not a linear disease. 1 minute they're here, the next minute they're not, and it's very subtle. And as and as my husband calls it, it's insidious. So he lost 2 jobs before he was diagnosed. And in 2012, we were at our wits' end in our marriage, in our relationship, and I was seeing a therapist. That's the get on the couch part. And she finally said to me, maybe he should go in for some neuropsych testing. And he did. And that was probably one of the most frustrating days of his whole life. He was immediately, it showed up as mild cognitive impairment. And it changed our lives. But we had gone through so much confusion together, and his way of compensating for it was blame and sense of humor. And after a while, it's not funny anymore. And losing your you have to keep your sense of humor in this disease, but at that point, it was almost a relief when we got the diagnosis. And for us, because he was so young, it was the 3rd neurologist we had seen. He had been having some other symptoms. He had been having, like pressure in his head, hot, cold, and then he would have memory issues. And it just wasn't on the neurologist's radar that he may have Alzheimer's. So they put him on seizure medication. So we kind of were tumbling down this road. And I think this, if his symptoms were showing up at this time, in this place, it would have been diagnosed sooner. But that was 10 years ago. So once he got the diagnosis, I needed to reach out for help because we talked about it's an isolating disease. It's an incredibly lonely disease, especially when you're living with it and you're really close, because the person with Alzheimer's can rise to the occasion when they need to. He would practice before he'd go to the doctor. He'd learn the dates, he'd practice. He would always rise to the occasion when we had company. And then when you're left alone, then you're dealing with someone that is relaxed and back into their groove. Ironically, about the same time he was diagnosed, I think because of my parents, I started working as a placement specialist, helping families place their loved ones in assisted living and memory care. And I was working for the largest company at that time in the nation, and we were on the phone 6 days a week. And at that time, there were about 250,000 calls nationwide coming in, and there were, I would say, over 80% were dementia related. And it started me saying, what the heck is going on out there? So I had someone at home, my own husband, and then these staggering numbers and these people that were so at their wits' end with what to do for placement or just looking for resources and options. So that started, by the end of 2013, this engine inside of me was building up, and I felt like I wanted to be the Paul Revere of saying, this disease is coming. We haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg yet. And we need to be prepared for it. And as we say, it's just not one of those sexy diseases that gets a lot of attention. The name associated with it, dementia, Alzheimer's, has such a stigma to it. So one night, I stopped work and I was working out of my home. And I came downstairs, and here's my husband with Alzheimer's, and I was very lonely and isolated and feeling quite trapped at that time. And my heart rate started going up. I noticed it was going up. And I did everything I could. I was breathing, I was doing yoga, so at about 4 hours into this, I knew from my experience with my father, that you can't sustain a resting heart rate. By then it was 160 beats a minute. So in my mind, it's like, I'm gonna have to make that call. So I made the call, I dialed 911. And there's just nothing like hearing the sirens and you know that they're coming for you. And by the time, when someone is at 160 beats a minute resting heart rate, you're unstable on your feet. It's not because you've been doing cardio. You're unstable on your feet and you're not thinking clearly. So they came in, and wouldn't you know, me being the caregiver, the first thing out of my mouth when they walked in was, my husband has Alzheimer's, he needs attention too. And so he got the attention he needed. We left the house that night, and of course, nobody's paying attention. We left the drapes open, the lights were on. I left my cell phone, my purse behind. The door was unlocked, and fortunately everything worked out. But we went to the hospital, and Gary slept next to me in a gurney. And at that point, he was very alert with it, independent. So he was able to take a taxi ride home the next day with no problem. And I'll never forget, as long as I live, the cardiologist who I'd never met before and I've never seen again. But he came into the room and he sat down on the bed and he took my hand. And he said, "You're lucky this time, but next time you may not be so lucky. This is your wake-up call. This could be a long journey." And when he left the room, I sobbed. I just sobbed because I knew it was the truth. And there's just something weird about, you're just going and going and going as a caregiver. There's just something weird about when you have an Ativan drip and you're looking at the wall going, wow, this is like a vacation. There's just something off about that. And it's a very expensive vacation, by the way. So that was my wake-up call. And in the work that I do in helping families every day, I let them know they're not alone. And we all work with families in many ways in this industry, that many families have lots of wake-up calls and they're still not paying attention. And if there's anything I can say to you today is, what's your wake-up call? Become aware. It's very, very difficult to place yourself first when you have a family member. There's almost an addiction to being needed. And I remember speaking to someone who I've become friends with, and I helped place her mother-in-law, and she was very successful, globally high-powered, and she stepped up to the plate to be the caregiver for her new mother-in-law. And one day she called me in tears, and she said, "I don't know if I can do this. I've never failed in my life, and this is the one job I feel like I'm failing at." And that hit it right on the head. I think, you get caught up in, we lose the sight of land very easily, and we don't want to fail. But it takes a lot of resources and a lot of circles of support for us to learn how to step back and make decisions. And I believe that this is a leadership role. And for every family dealing with this, someone has to step up to the plate. Someone has to identify that they're the leader and find their genuine way of leading softly. You'll never win an argument with someone with Alzheimer's. And if there's anything this disease has taught me, it's living in the moment. And we live in a culture that spends millions of dollars on how to live in the moment. We do. And we don't want to age, but we are. And how do we do that gracefully? How do we do this compassionately? How do we come together? How do we reach out and be together? I have to say that we discovered Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles in 2013, and we joined Memory Club, and that was the life-saving connection for us. Whenever they asked us, we faced this disease together. And whenever they've asked us to speak, we always stepped up because Paul Revere, hey, this is happening, and we need to talk about this. We need to erase the stigma and make it okay to reach out and talk about the feelings, those unspoken feelings that nobody wants to admit they have, because they're not always pretty, but we need to talk. And we need to continue talking and reach out. So many of us feel so alone, and we don't have to. It's an underlying ambiguous loss living with this disease. There is a book called by Dr. Pauline Boss called Loving Someone with Dementia, and she talks about ambiguous loss. It is loss without closure. And her statistics hit me between the eyes, is that someone living with this disease and as a caregiver is our health is 63% higher at risk than someone of dying than someone who isn't. And so I have lots of statistics that I do a lot of speaking, and they're staggering. And a lot of the caregiver statistics out there are outdated. Mine are. I'd love to talk with you, Linda, more about that, because it's a real thing. About a year and a half ago, I had to make the gut-wrenching decision to place my husband in assisted living. He had gone through knee surgery, had a bad reaction to the anesthesia and pain meds, and I was leaving town for a week, so it became the perfect storm. We made it through. He was really mad at me, and the guilt is tremendous. But so I've gone through the eye of the needle, as I call it, and he's thriving under the circumstances. He's now in moderate stage. He needs assistance. But he's still a happy guy. I'm very lucky. And I also believe that someone with Alzheimer's needs a calm environment, a smaller environment. They need compassion. And it's just, every moment is different. And as a family caregiver, we always have to look for the openings. I always tell the families I work with, look for the opening if you're looking to change a behavior or, integrate something. So that's my message today, is you're not alone. Let's keep talking about this. It's an important subject. It's the disease of our time. And it's great that you're here. And I just really acknowledge you for being here. And thank you for making this happen today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I know you've shared your story in many, many places with many people, but each time hearing the particulars of what you've gone through is really what opens up, it gives us a window on how it really is, how difficult it really is to cope with the disease when you get beyond generality. So thank you so much for being willing to be very personal and open up those scenes and those moments that really were turning points in your life. And now we're going to move on to our panelists. As I introduce them, I'd love for them to come forward and take a seat. Our first panelist is Anna Avdalian, if I said that correctly. She's program manager for the LA County Area Agency on Aging. She has managed a variety of programs for older adults and disabled populations for many years. She served as a manager of the LA County for over 17 years, and before that, she was the LA County Department of Public Social Services, Blue Shield of California, and you have your bachelor's in health science and an MBA degree in business administration and healthcare management. Thank you so much for being on our panel today. Our second panelist is Sheila Moore. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's been with the director of Comprehensive Senior Services for the Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles for the past 5 years. Before that, she was Director of Programs and Community Outreach at the Gay and Lesbian Elder Housing in Hollywood. You spent over 18 years as a clinical specialist and later as Director of the Center for Geriatric Health at Olympia Medical Center, Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us. It's also my pleasure to have on our panel Kathy Ladd. She's with Alzheimer's of Greater Los Angeles. I know Kathy from my service on the board. She brings 25 years experience working with older adults, caregivers, and professionals in a variety of settings, including community-based agencies, nursing homes, adult day centers, and various nonprofit organizations. So thank you all for being here. And what I'm going to do is have them each speak for, 5 minutes or so, describing specifically what they do and what kind of services they can offer to families and Alzheimer's and dementia patients. And we'll begin with Anna.
Yes, I think it's good afternoon now. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know we have a limited period of time. Again, my name is Anna Avdalian, managing the Area Agency on Aging. So what is Area Agency on Aging? It's not the AAA Auto Club. It's the state-designated agency. Came about in 1975. And area agencies on aging were basically designated to administer programs for elderly or disabled population throughout the nation. And LA County, as you know, the population of LA County is growing large, and in the next 20 years, the population 60 and over is about to double. So this is why it's our job in the area agencies on aging to design programs to accommodate the population, to make sure to ensure the health and dignity and well-being of older adults, to ensure the main goal of our programs is to keep them out of institutionalization and promote socialization. There are totally nationwide 33 area agencies on aging, and LA County is the only county that has 2 area agencies on aging, given the size of our county. We in our department serve the entire LA County, excluding the city of LA, since LA City has their own AAA. Basically, the programs we administer a multitude of programs, mainly under Older Americans Act, federal programs, again, to ensure elderly and disabled population are in their homes. Most of our programs, of course, help older adults with dementia and Alzheimer's. And as you may know, that a lot of the research shows that socialization is a key to at least slow down the disease process. So again, all of our programs target towards the socialization. Just very quickly, I'm going to go very quickly through the program, and please take this brochure. It's very helpful. You can find out about all of our programs and how to refer somebody to our programs. Just very briefly, we have the nutrition program, congregate meal program to promote socialization, where an older adult can go and socialize and have a nice lunch meal program. For homebound seniors, we have home delivered meal program. Just quickly give you a rough idea, in LA County, we provide 2.5 million meals annually. We have over 110 congregate meal sites, over 120 routes for home delivered meals. The other program, we have supportive services program. Specifically, we have Alzheimer's daycare services for Alzheimer's older adults or with dementia, to refer them to the licensed facility, adult daycare facility that specializes in Alzheimer's disease. We have health insurance and counseling and advocacy program. And by the way, to mention that there is no income limits for all of our programs, as long as they meet the age criteria, or if they have Alzheimer's disease or dementia of any age, they're qualified for our services. Supportive services program, ombudsman program investigating elder abuse program. And by the way, besides the Area Agency of Aging program, our department administers the Adult Protective Services Division. Again, if you are aware of any, and abuse can range from physical, psychological, emotional, and what we see particularly is financial abuse. That's number one abuse that we encounter, and we send social workers to investigate. Again, the information can be found outside, and please, if you know of anybody that is being encountered of any kind of abuse, please give us a call and we'll send out a social worker. So that's basically, in a nutshell, our programs. And most importantly, not only we provide care for our older adults, but we also have this great family caregiver support program to take care of caregivers, ranging from caregiver support services, caregiver training, respite, so they can have a couple of hours of their own time, and other supportive services for caregivers. So without expanding, again, please get our brochures, and there's a detailed information on our program.
And we'll hear more about what you do
Yes.
as the
Thank
panel
you.
continues. Sheila, tell us a little bit more about what the Jewish Family I keep saying Jewish Family Services, but it's Jewish Family Service.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. I don't know. Can you load
The Jewish
Kathy? Actually, Kathy's is loaded. Do you mind?
That's the Alzheimer's Greater LA. We can go to Kathy, or she's got it. She's got it.
I can try. You want to do mine? So I'll just say that how honored I am to be here today. This is such a wonderful presentation, and something that's, I think, really long overdue in terms of bringing community together to hear more about major neurocognitive disorders.
Or decline.
That's going to be an old dog and a new trick. That's right. And providing services to those who care for individuals with memory loss. It is a distinct pleasure to be here to share the panel with colleagues that I've known for a very long time.
Did you want the slide changer?
Yeah, I'll need that too. Thanks. That's okay.
Yes.
Sure.
That's it. There you go.
How's that?
That's better.
Great. So I was just saying that what an honor it is to be here and to talk a little bit about Jewish Family Service and the work that we do in the community. Two things at once. So I wanted to start out a little bit with our vision statement. Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles is an extended family of compassionate social services that enriches the community and improves the lives of countless men, women, and children of all religions, ethnicities, and ages. For over 160 years, JFS has counseled families, fed the hungry, sheltered the homeless, and protected the vulnerable. As Los Angeles' oldest and most dynamic charitable organization, JFS is a trusted source of care and support, meeting the diverse and changing needs of a diverse and changing city and community. At JFS, we serve our community through, I'm talking mostly about our senior centers, through our senior center at Israel 11, which is in Venice, over in West Los Angeles, Felicia Mahood Multipurpose Senior Center, Freedom Moore Multipurpose Senior Center, kind of mid-city, our Valley storefront in North Hollywood, and here in West Hollywood at our West Hollywood Comprehensive Service Center. Today we're going to focus on the services that we provide for those who have memory loss and those who care for them. And I think when we're talking about those who care for them, oh boy, we're talking not only about families, but it could be neighbors, it could be storefront businesses, people who come in contact with those who have memory loss and those who are concerned. JFS provides a safety net of services. We collaborate with partners, and we reduce the gaps in services to those who have memory loss and those who care for them. We link to community resources through information and referral. And within the agency, we say there's really no wrong door in terms of where someone can call. And I really like to think that as a partner in the community, we would like it to be that there is no wrong door in terms of anyone who has memory loss or those who care for them, in terms of the general community, whether someone's calling the Alzheimer's Association or the county or the city or JFS. We also coordinate services for those who have memory loss in their families. We do case management services. We identify needs. We make plans together. We provide support and empower our clients, and we achieve goals. We are an advocacy, and we also provide guidance for those with memory loss and their family members. We also provide education. Education is power. We do that through educational workshops, through evidence-based programming, through our powerful tools for caregivers, and through one-on-one education with family caregivers. We have support groups, and we also have evidence-based programming. Like our powerful tools for caregivers, we also do a time slips program for those who have memory impairment. We provide we have other services like home-delivered meals, congregate meals, counseling services that really support those who live in the community. Like Anna and the county, our goal is to keep people in their homes as long as possible, avoiding premature institutionalization. Another program that we have is all our arts, wellness, and engagement programming, and we talked about the importance of socialization and the impact that isolation has on health outcomes, not only for those who have memory problems, but for their caregivers as well. So our targets are for the persons with memory loss. Oftentimes, the services that we provide to those who are isolated and may have no one in the community except the resources like JFS. Persons with memory loss who might have family, who might live in town and out of town, and then of course family caregivers. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, we'll hear more from Sheila as the panel goes on. Kathy.
So while he's loading, I just want to say thank you to Lisa Brooker for her courage and for being the Paul Revere that she is. We need more Paul Reveres, and thank you for speaking today. So I'm with Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles, and before we begin, I just want to say a little bit about community resources, and you know, they're not all equal. And it's important for those of you in the community, as you well know, to find the right resource at the right time. And for people with Alzheimer's or dementia, that means if you're in the early stage, it might not be appropriate to go to an organization or go to a resource for something that's more geared to somebody in the middle or late stages. So be aware of what stage the person is in as you make referrals or as you seek community resources. Income is also an issue. So you wouldn't, for example, ask a high-powered attorney to help you with financial planning if you are a low-income person. And there are services available, legal aid services, that are more appropriate for someone who has lower income. So considering cultural needs, Spanish-speaking, monolinguals, families might not be able to participate in some daycare centers if those services aren't offered. So just being aware of what is available. We're lucky we live in Los Angeles. There's many resources. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, there's so much. And families, we have found, generally like to have the information both verbally and in writing, and more than once. Be proactive, thinking of what services they need now, as Lisa said, in the moment and in the future. And don't overwhelm families with a million different resources. When someone gets the diagnosis in the beginning, they can barely take that information in, much less think of where to turn next. So keep it simple. Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles. So the first thing I need to say is that we are not the Alzheimer's Association. We are Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles, and we're the only local organization providing services for people with dementia and their caregivers and families for over 36 years. We focus, as Val said, on our services. We have a long history of providing multicultural services in a variety of languages. Our staff are culturally competent. We are aware of what we do and how we deliver our services to this diverse community. And all of our services are free of charge. We have a 24-hour helpline, and our staff are multilingual. We do have a translation line that offers 140 different languages. And we provide resources, we provide information, and we also are able to help people who are in crisis in the moment. We had a call the other day from a woman who said, I'm standing here with my mother, she wants to get into a car. We're in the street and she wants to get into a car, what do I do? Oh my gosh, now she's trying to get on the bus, and she got on the bus. We had counselors available to help her, walk her through the moment. She couldn't think that, yes, she needed to get on the bus with her loved one, and then calmly talk her down and get off at the next stop. When you're in the moment and panicked, it's hard. Our counselors can help walk you through that step-by-step process. We also have a website that is pretty informational. You'll see educational materials, a calendar of events, we have resources, we have clinical trial information, we have advocacy and volunteer opportunities. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website, which is alzgla.org. One of the other nice services that we offer is counseling. It's one-on-one counseling services for caregivers and people with the disease. And we will assess the situation, we will set up a plan of care, we'll make referrals to various organizations if we cannot provide it. We do problem solving, and one of the nice things is you don't have to tell your story to different people over and over as the disease progresses. You tell your story once to your counselor, you've got your counselor for as long as that disease and as long as you wish to have that support. We were fortunate enough to receive a grant to provide services for people who live alone. And 1/3 of people who live alone in the community who have Alzheimer's live alone. They're at higher risk for a whole multitude of problems. We don't want to go into that now, but we were fortunate to work with Northern California to develop an algorithm, sort of a step-by-step process for people that's available on our table outside. On the other side, there's an intervention options, a nice little handy tool. In addition, we developed a guide for people living alone, supporting those living alone with memory loss. It also has resources, local resources, and tips in this guide. We have other programs. We have our evidence-based programs similar to the one that Sheila spoke about, our Savvy Caregiver, which is also available in Spanish and is also available in a shortened version of 3 sessions. We have a whole variety of community educational programs available throughout Los Angeles, available in different languages and topics ranging from brain health to dealing with behavior and communication issues and everything in between. We have a whole array of activity programs and engagement programs and services tailored to people in the early stages. Lisa talked about Memory Club, which is our program for people who are in the early stages of the disease and their care partners. And we also offer over 140 support groups throughout Los Angeles County. You may have noticed if you stop by our table, our tip sheets, our fact sheets that are in plain language. Many times caregivers are very overwhelmed. They don't have time to read a lot of information. So we've developed in both English, Spanish, and Chinese, different fact sheets on things like keeping your home safe, medications, repeating, and some of the basic kind of behavioral issues that caregivers face on a regular basis. They're simple, they're easy to read, and you can download them at our website. And then finally, I'd encourage everyone who knows someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia to enroll in Medical Alert. Medical Alert is a very simple, low-tech way of offering a bracelet to your loved one. It's not a tech, it doesn't track the person if they lose, but if they're lost or wander, but it does identify an 800 number that's available 24/7. And I know that Val just did last night, I don't know if any of you saw KCET, and they did, she did a segment on Nancy Palikas, who wandered away from LACMA over a year ago and has never been found. So this is a very common symptom of people with Alzheimer's or dementia, so I encourage you all to do that. It's also going to be aired again on Sunday, 6:30, and it can be found on the web if you go to KCET. And finally, if for those of you in the community who wish to make a warm referral to Alzheimer's Greater Los Angeles, we make it easy. You're working with clients who might need us. You just ask for their permission, fill out a form called Alls Direct Connect, and it's sent to a confidential email, and we reach out to the family. The family doesn't need to reach out to us. They've already given permission, and it just makes it a whole lot easier for families who are so overwhelmed. And that's us. That's our helpline, 844-HELP-ALLS, and our website. Thank you.
Great. Those are great overviews, and now we're going to get a little deeper into what they do, and we're going to do it in a little unusual way. Instead of asking questions, although, by the way, you will have a chance to ask questions, and I encourage you once again to write your question on a card. If you don't have them, they're at the back of the room. But in the meantime, we're going to explore what each of these organizations do in more depth by giving them scenarios. I'm going to read scenarios that may be familiar or may be something you encounter in the future, and they can give us an idea of how they would respond to that particular scenario. And I'll start with Anna with the LA County Agency on Aging. So Anna, you receive a call from a woman regarding her elderly aunt who is residing at home alone. According to the woman, her aunt was ambulatory, able to walk, and in general good health, but on a recent visit, she noticed that her aunt frequently neglected to eat and that she appeared to be malnourished. The caller made inquiries regarding meal programs that might be available to assist her aunt with eating properly during the day, as she believed her aunt may be forgetting to eat. So Anna, how would you respond to this kind of call? Somebody who's concerned about a loved one not eating properly.
So among the programs I mentioned earlier, first of all, we would refer to the Linkages program, which is a case management program, which is comprised of care management, assessment, and developing an individualized assessment plan for this older adult. And since you mentioned that, I believe you mentioned that she's ambulatory, which means she can attend one of our congregate meal sites. So we would locate a nearest senior center for her that would give her an opportunity for socialization and enjoy a healthy meal. By the way, all of our meals are strictly designed with strict menus under the USDA dietary guidelines. So again, Linkages program to have a case manager assess her situation, her cognitive state, and develop an individualist plan, and of course refer to one of our nutrition sites for socialization. That's what we would do. You also mentioned some self-neglect, where I felt self-neglect whenever we hear she's malnourished or she has some kind of self-neglecting sign. We always refer to Adult Protective Services so that just a social worker can do a check, because self-neglect is sort of like a self-abuse that we would like to check on. So just off the top of my head, I can easily refer her to those three programs.
So what I'm hearing is, though, even though you might check on someone with a particular problem, it opens the door to evaluating their larger situation, correct? Because obviously, if someone's not eating well, that's not the only problem they're having. There could be, their finances could be a mess, you know, a lot of things could be happening. So when you go, you don't just deal with the particular issue that alerted you to the situation? Is that what I'm picking up?
Yes, and that's kind of what the case manager is looking for. That's why everybody has a unique situation in their household, so this is why we need to have a one-on-one case manager. And yes, one can lead to another, and definitely they may be eligible to more services, which they may not realize at the beginning.
Great. So one problem can actually open up the door and solve a lot of problems or deal with a lot of problems. Sheila, here's a scenario for you. This is a couple, Ed and Joe. Joe has been getting more forgetful. He's prone to getting angry with Ed for minor things and at times will accuse Ed of taking money from their bank account. Ed is fearful of leaving Joe at home by himself after a recent incident when Ed came back from shopping to find Joe was wandering in the courtyard of their apartment with food heating on the stove. Ed is overwhelmed and confides in his neighbor that he feels he's at his breaking point. He, Ed, the caregiver, often does not sleep well, he misses meals, and confesses he has been drinking more lately. So how would you enter and deal with this situation? Again, it's not just Joe who's being forgetful, but Ed, who's the caregiver and clearly under stress.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see often when someone has memory loss that there's the second, when I was working at the Center for Geriatric Health, we say it's the second patient, which was the caregiver, who needs equal attention. Steve Zaret wrote a book many years ago called The Hidden Victims of Alzheimer's Disease, Caregivers Under Stress. And so this is a great illustration of how caregivers can, in their dutiful taking care of things, as Lisa illustrated as well, taking care, don't realize that they themselves are depleted. So the opportunity here is to create a relationship with Ed, to get him the kind of support that he needs, perhaps through one-on-one counseling, perhaps through support groups, perhaps through some of our evidence-based programming, and as well as talking to him more about what's going on with Joe and how we can help him make some different kinds of interventions. You know, if he's becoming more paranoid, maybe delusional, maybe it's time to encourage him to go see the doctor and find out what's going on. Is this a sudden change? Is this something that's been going on for a while? So really the opportunity to assess both Ed and Joe in terms of what we're seeing as what we would call the presenting problem, or the presenting issue, and then having the opportunity to, in tandem, create an intervention that is very specific and personal to both of them.
Now, when you approach them, do you sort of assign one caseworker, or would they be dealing with a variety of people at JFS?
It's likely that when they call in, they would call into what we have people who are on the phone, we call them on intake, who are prepared and able to link people with community resources, as well as really take the time to listen to the stories, to what's going on, what are the concerns, what are the problems, and from there they would be assigned a social worker who would follow them.
And Kathy, here's a scenario for you. Mary, an older woman who lives alone in a local senior housing complex, used to visit the library frequently to take out books, but the library staff hasn't seen her in a while. One day, Mary wanders into the library and appears to be confused and somewhat disheveled. She does not appear to recognize where she is or how she got there. She has a cell phone but doesn't seem to know how to use it. When asked, she doesn't know her address, and the library staff is unsure what to do. So the library staff calls Alzheimer's Greater LA.
So when they call our helpline, hopefully they would call our helpline, we would have someone who would be able to walk them through step by step. The first thing is to not panic and to not argue. As Lisa said, you'll never win. Speaking calmly and speaking compassionately with this woman. And she's obviously, as we had talked about earlier, has some issues other than just this current state. There's something obviously going on and we don't know what. She might need immediate medical attention. And if she's willing and gives the phone over to the staff, I would encourage the library staff to look to see if there are any contacts that could be called, to let them know that what's happening. And then unfortunately, I think this is something where really the police need to be notified, because we don't know what her condition is, we don't know what her issues are, and she needs to be assessed. She could be at risk for being in the hospital immediately. So calling the helpline, they can help step by step, looking at the phone. And then finally, I just want to add, we just signed an agreement that we will be the trainer for dementia-friendly communities, and this is a perfect example of how communities can be dementia-friendly, meaning library staff, first responders, postal service employees, whoever comes in contact with someone who is showing signs of dementia or forgetfulness or wandering can be trained to actually do something about it.
Great, and I'd like to take a moment now to have Lisa join the panel, because we're going to open up to questions, and I know that Lisa can probably answer some of the questions that you have. Here's a couple that have come in. We work with the homeless population. There are a few seniors who live on the streets with dementia. Do you provide any housing services for these seniors, so homeless seniors with dementia? And unfortunately, that is also going to be a growing problem, just like dementia is going to be a problem in the general population, is going to continue and will be a growing problem in our homeless population. Who would like to take that on? Is that an LA County kind of question?
First of all, for LA County, homeless population is definitely an adult protective services referral. So I would call the Adult Protective Services line, because one of the task of our Adult Protective Services is to find a shelter for homeless population. So definitely that's what I would recommend from the county side. Aside that, county has a major initiative, and there's a special unit working on this. It's work in process. So there's a lot of work is done at the Chief Executive Office of LA County. But APS is definitely the call that should be made for shelter placement.
Right. And by the way, I want to make people aware of something that is fantastic that I didn't even know, is that when you don't know where to start, if you know that somebody needs some services, you don't know where to start, there's this great service, it's 211. How many people know of 211? Great. It's like 911, but it's 211. You call there, and it's amazing. I visited the place. It's an incredible place where everybody has been trained in just scores and scores of social services. So if you know that somebody, you see a homeless person or something, but you can't figure out what bureau to call because it's overwhelming, just call 211. And they can really, really be helpful. They have access, computer access to all these different organizations and social services, and they can help.
They're one of our major partners,
Yes.
and Adult Protective Services referral can be made through 211 as well.
So start there, because you'll go crazy trying to find the particular group that needs to help the situation you're in. Here's a scenario for all of you, or some of you. Let's say you're a store owner, or let's say you are in a store shopping, and you see an older customer come in, and you see him or her take something and start to walk out without paying. What can a person do to be sure that she's not stealing the merchandise, that they're confused and not, actually trying to commit a crime? What kinds of questions might the store owner, if you're a store owner, ask that person? Do you call the police? Do you not? What's an appropriate response as a business person to that situation? Anyone want to take this on?
I think a conversation is needed. You can't jump to conclusions one way or another. I think by talking to someone more than a minute, depending, you can tell if there are cognitive issues. So I would approach the person very calmly, as I mentioned earlier, not accusing them of anything, but trying to engage them in a conversation not related to the item that was just stolen, but to try to do a kind of a quick assessment to see if they had cognitive issues. And if there were cognitive issues, then you have to deal with it as someone who is not able to have insight into something like that.
And I'd recommend all of us, as customers, as citizens, as people who might notice a situation, obviously if they're elderly, the first thing you want to do is you don't treat them the same as if, they're a 16-year-old boy who's going through adolescence. So I think we can all step in gently and make sure that someone is treated kindly, and I think all it takes is maybe a short conversation to kind of find out if an elderly person, has it together or not. So I think this is something we can all do.
I would say too that this could be a symptom of many, many issues. Besides Alzheimer's disease or dementia, it could be that this person is hungry. It could be, all kinds of different things. And so I agree with Kathy that to have a conversation and maybe sit them down if they're amenable, and then be able to link them to one of the resources here, depending upon, what the conversation. And it would be different if it's someone that the shop owner knew as well.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes the regulars might come in, and you might, as someone who is a business person, might have customers whose behaviors change, and that in itself is a red flag as well, that something might be going on.
That's right. Here's a question. My mother's 88 years old on Tuesday. Congratulations. We were told that she has a vascular dementia. She is starting to say real evil things like my sister-in-law is a witch and that men are walking to her room touching her. Is this typical behavior? Also, she keeps asking to go home. How do we let her know she is home without upsetting her? Boy, who wants to handle that? Is this familiar?
I'll take that one on. Well, there's a saying, if you've met someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, you've met one person with Alzheimer's or dementia, and it seems to take on a personality. It takes a personality and can put it on steroids, and whichever way it goes. That's what makes this such a unique, unpredictable disease. Sometimes we have to look at, there's many different forms of dementia, of course, but sometimes we have to remember to be calm and look at maybe what's provoking that behavior. Is there something that's upsetting them? And really being present with that person. I mean, there are no answers always. There's no black and white answer to any of these behaviors, but being calm and present and understanding and redirecting, maybe just going with it and in the moment to see however that behavior can be neutralized. Anything's worth a try. Just don't confront and reach out for help. That's what the 24-hour support lines are for, and reach out for the resources.
Other thoughts? Because my thought was that although you say your mother was diagnosed with vascular dementia, it seems like some of the symptoms are a little bit more, Dr. Igley? I see. So even vascular dementia, you could have symptoms that can sometimes sound like Alzheimer's. Gotcha. Very good.
You can have both.
Yeah, that's true.
We have mixed.
Right. And I just, if you don't mind, that as a caregiver in that situation, you'd want to reduce your own stress by confronting someone to, I've seen many caregivers trying to confront someone to make sure that they were kind of oriented to the reality that this is home. And oftentimes what happens when someone has memory impairment is that it's the concrete question that you hear, but there's a lot more that's happening behind it. It might be them, I want to go home. Well, what does really home mean for all of us? A place where we're comfortable, a place where we're safe, a place that we're kind of reassured. So I would recommend that when those questions like that come up and kind of your ire gets up and you're kind of ready, like, oh, Mom, you're home, would be like, everything's going to be okay, kind of reassuring. And I love that distracting is often helpful. And particularly sometimes those kinds of questions come up in the evening time, which is more like sundowning, like turning on the lights, kind of doing things in routine, sometimes can help reassure someone without using language.
Also, I'll never forget the story I heard on the radio about a year ago. There was a nursing home that took care of dementia patients. It was in Europe. And they found that the dementia patients, of course, would wander, and one of their favorite places to go would be a bus stop nearby, and then they would get on the bus because they want to go home. So, they have to go out and they'd get them from the bus station, and there would be this tussle and so forth and so on, and it was always a hassle. So guess how they very creatively dealt with it? Well, they put a fake bus stop with a bench in front of the nursing home, And so the patients would go there, and they would often know they were there, and they would let them sit there for a little bit, and the bus would never come because it was a fake one. And then they would go over, oh, are you ready to come back now? Yes. So it was like such a gentle way to solve that problem and a safe way to solve it because the fake bus station was right there on their property. So there's, gentle ways to deal with this without being confrontational. 3 more questions are all very good. Congress is working on massive cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. If those cuts happen, what programs that you currently have might be harmed or eliminated? So are any of your organization's programs dependent on Medicare or Medicaid? Anyone want to start with that? Or are any of you familiar with the services that are offered by Medicare and Medicaid that might be affected if cuts go through?
All
know
I
there
can
are some less
say
spectacular
is, as a placement specialist, our Medi-Cal,
Medi-Cal is
is
California's version of
Medicaid
Medicaid.
in California. Well, and Medicare does not pay, first of all, Medicare does not pay for long-term care placement. That is the medical insurance for seniors. Medi-Cal is for low income, and it's already a broken system. It's very frustrating for those of us in this industry to help someone with low income. It doesn't mean that there aren't answers. We have to get creative sometimes, but it's a broken system, and any more funding cuts will continue to affect it. And that's just the reality. It takes voices in Sacramento and in our nationwide government to make a difference.
Yes, and if anybody's ever had to deal with Medicare or Medicaid when it comes to long-term care for a loved one, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. And I think in some cases, you actually have to spend down your assets before you qualify under Medicaid or Medi-Cal for long-term care for your loved one. You have to, in a sense, impoverish yourself, unfortunately.
But don't run out of money first before you take that leap, because you do need funds.
Yes.
We do need to come together. So a lot of families make the mistake of running out of money and thinking that then they can start, and that is not the case.
Another question. Healthcare, generally, are these tests reimbursable by Medicare? Another Medicare, Medi-Cal question. What associations are advocating for better access to early detection, especially in vulnerable populations? So 2 questions. 1, generally, are these tests, I think you're talking about the cognitive tests, reimbursable by Medicare? My understanding is that they are if you have signs that the tests are required. Is that correct? You can't just go in and say, give me a test.
It has to be medical necessity.
Medical necessity. Okay. And that medical necessity might be what?
There are 2 ways to do it. One is, I think everyone should go to their doctor first. I don't think anybody should go just to a neuropsychologist without having a doctor. If you find something wrong, then you want to be able to direct that person to a care specialist. So it's usually better to go to your doctor first and get the referral for neuropsych testing. That's what I would recommend.
What association?
Question.
Yes.
What if you're in an HMO, let's say, you're in a health maintenance organization? What's the experience? I mean, I remember from my times in working that it was really, you had to be, talk about the services in terms of advocacy. What has your experience, doctor, in terms of?
Yes. Why don't you come up and use the mic?
I feel like I've already had my time. If you have an HMO, you have to ask within your HMO for the services. And if, for example, if you have Kaiser, you have to get your services within Kaiser, and they have neuropsychologists there. They have people that are specialists in dementia there. I hear some stories of frustration, though, honestly, from people who have HMOs because people get turned down. It's much better, and from my vantage point as a provider who does accept Medicare, you have more flexibility and freedom if you can if you can actually go to a doctor and not have, not have to be turned down because you don't appear sick enough for someone. So that's the part that I think I have a bias in, especially if you're coming from a early detection, early treatment bias. But yes, you should be able to, for example, if you, depending on your policy, you should be able to go to a Medicare provider. The hard part is finding one. And we need more Medicare providers so that we can handle the growing volume of people who need these kind of evaluations.
And I would add that regardless, you have to be your own advocate. And it's especially challenging for people who are younger onset, because a lot of times physicians, just like Lisa went through, didn't believe or don't take it seriously. So be your own advocate, and don't accept a diagnosis of it's just old age if there are truly concerns. You have to be your own voice.
What associations are advocating for better access to early detection, especially in vulnerable populations? Are there any groups out there that are advocating for better access to early detection, especially in vulnerable populations? Anybody know of any group that's doing that in particular? Or is it part of what you all do?
Well, we have a very active public policy advocacy
I'm chair of that committee.
Committee, yeah, Val, thank you. And in addition to that, we've made several inroads in terms of healthcare systems and advocating for people to get the diagnosis early, and in actually having physicians document that it is a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or a related dementia, which, believe it or not, they don't always do. And in helping train care managers who are on the ground in healthcare plans to help identify people with Alzheimer's or other dementias.
Mm-hmm. Also, I would like to make a case, and this is something that is not talked about a lot. One of the biggest obstacles to making progress with medical remedies and treatments for Alzheimer's is lack of participation in clinical trials. There are many, many clinical trials that are very promising. They're having a really hard time getting people with memory loss, suspected memory loss, to sign up for these trials. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Alzheimer's is often not diagnosed early enough and effectively enough by physicians, and therefore those patients that, if they were diagnosed earlier, might be referred to a clinical trial. But clinical trials depend on human participation, and there's a lot of very promising stuff out, but they're crawling along because people are not participating. Now, one of the benefits, if you have the courage to involve yourself in the clinical trials, is you can get access to many of these tests that are very expensive, but you will get them for free if you are part of the clinical trial. And so I know there's one, what's it called, A4? There's one, a major one, I think it is, that I think you have to be 65, and if you suspect you might have memory loss, or you go get tested to see if you have a memory loss. If you have memory loss, you're enrolled in the trial, and you get those PET scans and the MRIs and so forth. Or you get them actually at the very beginning to see if you're even at risk of Alzheimer's. So personally, when I hit 65, yes, I'm gonna see if I can be part of that trial, if nothing else, to get the early detection services. So I encourage people to have the courage to, clinical trial information is all over the websites. I know Alzheimer's Greater LA website has an access, was it called Trial Match? I forget what it's called.
Trials.gov.
Clinicaltrials.gov. You can enroll, your loved one, you can learn a lot for yourself, and you can also really personally help progress the research that will eventually, we hope, lead to treatment and maybe even a cure. But they depend on people participating. So that's my big push for clinical trials. And I think the doctor will second me on that. Okay, what I'd like to do is have this final question and then just final thoughts from each of the panelists. Are there examples, and this is a lovely way to end, thank you whoever wrote this, are there examples of joyful or heartwarming experiences for caregivers dealing with mid or late period dementia, like the patient hugging them or thanking them? Are there moments in the course of a very difficult caregiving experience, those moments that can actually rejuvenate you or make you realize that, yes, perhaps this is worth it. Any thoughts, experiences?
You know, I don't know, Lisa, if you want to address that, and then I have a couple examples, but I'd like to defer.
I think that's what keeps me going. I am very fortunate that my husband thanks me. He thanks me for being there for him. And, but all the families that I work with, I mean, there are times we just chuckle because it can be funny. It's a silver lining, and in our own experience, we've met. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Unfortunately, Gary isn't able to join me anymore. He has trouble finding his words, and he's much slower. But we face this together, and we've met so many amazing people and had incredible opportunities. And I encourage all the families, and there are things that we share with other families that you just can't forget your sense of humor, because there are just some comical things that happen. And I would love to write a book on that, because it's life. It's life, and life doesn't stop just because of the circumstances, and we have to look for that.
I remember when my father had dementia, I got up in the morning, we had a cat at the time, and my mother think she was in the hospital, so my father kind of had to do things. And I looked down at the cat dish, it was in the morning, and there was orange juice in it. And of course, I said, how did orange juice get in the cat dish? And of course, my father said, well, it's breakfast time for the cat. So he's like, and then another time, my mother had dementia, and it was unusual. We were taking a trip from like San Diego, I think, up to LA, and we were carpooling. There were two cars, you know, some family members in one, some family members in the other. So my mother was in one car behind us, and we were in the front. And we made a pit stop, so, you know, one car, and of course, you're in communication. So one car pulls over to the gas station and stops, and then our second car pulls up, and my mom's in the second car, and of course you go to see how the other guys are. So I open up the door, you know, and my mom goes, what are you doing here? Because the concept of, you know, caravan was like, oh my God, she went somewhere and suddenly I appeared out of nowhere. So there are really charming moments, and I'm sure we've all had them. So what final thoughts might you offer? Anything that you didn't get to cover that you think is very important before we close? And we can start with Anna.
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I haven't had personally an experience to deal with this, but my parents are getting there, so they're constantly warning me, please let me know if I get there, please let me know if I get there. And frankly, we're planning, we're at the planning stages. So I would say planning is very, very important. And
single most important.
Yes, and hopefully one day the cure can be found. What can I say? So hopefully, and thank you for Alzheimer's or Greater LA. Thank you.
Sheila.
Thank you. You know, boy, I have lots of, I almost feel like I have lots of closing thoughts. But, you know, sitting here, and I just want to go back to those joyful moments, because this is such a devastating disease, and it can really take one down kind of in all aspects of life, you know, emotionally, physically, financially. It really can ravage not only the individual, but the whole family system. And, you know, thinking here today, you know, I've had the great, absolute pleasure to spend 30 years of my life, and Kathy, really, we started out together 30 years ago, working with, not only with people who had who were impaired with cognitive changes, but with their caregivers. And what strikes me over these decades is the resilience of the human spirit, not only for the caregiver, but for the person with the impairment. And, you know, it's in looking back, I think, and sometimes it's in looking back over the course of the disease that a caregiver will say, wow, I did that. Or it could be sometimes just as changes occur and you're fortunate to have a support network that says, you know, look what you were able to accomplish. Look at how far you've come. Look at how you've grown. So I do want to say that there have been moments that I've seen caregivers just absolutely rise to the occasion. Sometimes it's when someone's personality changes, they can actually soften when they were bristly. And I've had caregivers say, I'm so grateful for this time because my mother will let me hug her and she hugs me back. I mean, it's those kind of tiny, tender moments that can heal relationships. So in the darkness of this, I really do believe there's opportunity for light. And I will say that my banner is about caregivers. You know, that has been that really, please take care of yourself. There's so much energy is spent making sure and maintaining the care of the person that you have in your charge, whether that's a parent or a spouse. But it's so critical to take care of. I mean, Lisa's experience was very, very powerful. The idea of there are wake-up calls. Please pay attention. Please make room for yourself. Sometimes I think that put your oxygen mask on, absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes it's even just making a tiny bit of room in your thinking for yourself as the very first start. So I can't say enough of how important it is to, as caregivers and those who provide care, even neighbors who are caring for neighbors, it's amazing how people survive. That you really need to think of yourself, and it's okay to be a little selfish and think of yourself first, because all your plans will disintegrate in a heartbeat if you don't take care of yourself. So it has been an absolute pleasure to be here this morning, and I thank all of you who come and those who will be viewing this. And together we can make some changes. So thank you.
And we hear so often from families affected by this disease about the stigma. So having symposiums like this today is such an important step. And we need to get over the stigma that isolates families that are affected by this disease. And it starts by being all the things we've talked about today, being an advocate with your physician, being aware of what the symptoms and what the issues are, supporting caregivers, becoming educated, knowing that there are resources out there for families so you don't have to be alone. I think we have to all carry that banner and say, we will not let the stigma affect us, and we will be as advocates for change as cancer was 30, 40 years ago, as AIDS was 20 years, 30 years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we will eventually, if everyone is willing and able, find a cure. Until that time, be supportive of one another, learn more, become part of a dementia-friendly community, and act when it's needed.
Final thought, Lisa?
Well, no one signs up for this. But I think this journey, along the way, you'll learn who your friends are, who your family is. Every family handles this differently. You'll find yourself saying, who are these people? And it's so important to circle yourself with support and find your inner circle, create one. Also, surround yourself with trusted advisors. I don't make a major decision without leaning on my trusted advisors, be it my financial person, my CPA, an attorney, my friends. It's so important to not be alone on this journey. And that's why we're here today, to increase that conversation, to connect those dots. And there is an army of us out there. And it's hard to reach out for support. So just remember, and one of the things that to keep in mind when you're stuck, because you can get stuck, the fastest way out of a hole is to reach out and make a request. And it's that simple. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your time, your expertise, your thoughts. And thank you all for coming. So you have all these resources here, websites, phones, phone numbers, and of course the faces behind the organization. So we really appreciate it. I'm sorry, what is it? Evaluations, yes. Please do take just a minute for an evaluation. It helps us a lot when we put on these things in the future. And thank you again for coming. Have a lovely day.
And just another note, if you're getting your CEUs, you have a separate evaluation, so please make sure you get that filled out.
Thank you, Val, for being a wonderful, wonderful moderator. It's a pleasure. Thank you.